those of you who've been tuning into my live streams are aware that I've recently been playing through Super Mario Galaxy 2. I'm like 30 stars in. I'm having a blast. I declared it like my favorite 3D Mario game. It's better than Super Mario Galaxy. There are some things I have issues with, like, the game doesn't have like the atmosphere of the original Galaxy. I miss the Comet Observatory. I miss Rosalina. The music isn't as good. Like the levels seem kind of like, levels instead of actual locations, right? Like there are things to complain about when it comes to Galaxy 2, right? But all in all, like I love this game, right? I think it's phenomenal. I think it's wonderful. I think it's like one of the best games on Wii. It's one of my favorite Mario games. It's like a phenomenal experience every time I play it. I am very, very surprised at how good it is. And I kind of had to stop and think, like, well, why am I surprised at this? Like, why am I so taken aback by how good Super Mario Galaxy is? Super Mario Galaxy 2 is. And I realized why. When Super Mario Galaxy 2 came out, game journalists, shills, and YouTubers tried very hard to paint Super Mario Galaxy 2 as a DLC, right? And not a real sequel. Oh, it uses the same engine. Oh, it looks the same. Oh, it's not all that different. Oh, it's not as good, right? It's just more of the same of the best game of its kind ever made, right? And I thought about this for a little bit and I realized that, like, wow, this is the same thing they did with The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Like the exact same thing, right? They're not making any real points about the gameplay, the structure, the content, the mechanics, the new additions, the new power-ups. Like they're not talking about the game itself. They're talking about some superficial thing that doesn't really matter. That it shares an engine that it looks and plays very similarly to an older game in the franchise. Never mind that that older game was a major innovator and a major, major deal in pushing the franchise further in the eyes of the general population, and that like it needed a sequel, that people did want more of it, that Super Mario Galaxy 2 was this phenomenal thing that should have been made, that there were plenty of ideas to expand on and like add, and just that the game is completely different in spite of its similarities. Like, let's not talk about any of that. Let's try and convince people that Red Dead Redemption 2 is good. Let's try and convince people that like the Wii is on the way out. Like it's been dying since New Super Mario Bros. Wii. And that Super Mario Galaxy 2 can't save the console, right? The best-selling console of the generation. Oh, it can't compete with the real consoles, right? Like, it's the same thing we're seeing now with the Switch, right? Like, so many people wrote off Super Mario Galaxy 2 when it came out that I wasn't even aware that like it was a narrative being pushed. I thought it was an actual organic reaction to this game, right? But as I gained experience, as I watched YouTube videos from people like the Emperor, Baron Black, that guy who were like openly talking about this, how this wasn't getting like the props it deserves as being one of the best games of that year, right? When I compare it to what's happening now with Super Mario Bros. Wonder and the Tears of the Kingdom, like it's the same thing over and over again, right? Game journalists are trying to push the lesser games from other studios over the far superior Nintendo ones, and it's not working. Right? Like, it's crazy how people in my age group can go back and play stuff like Super Mario Land, which was before my time, and have a blast with it, right? How people can play Super Mario Galaxy 2 after a decade and have fun with it. How people can play stuff like Twilight Princess, right? Another game that was written off to a certain degree in spite of being the best-selling Zelda game ever at the time, right? Like, I'm playing more and more of these games, particularly on Wii, and I'm kind of remembering just like, wow, this was written off. This was ignored. This was downplayed. This was one of those games that nobody talked about because they didn't want to admit that the Wii was better than other consoles, right? The narrative was always that the Wii was a fad that would soon go away, and that never happened. Like, the Wii was extremely successful throughout its lifespan, and honestly, the only thing the propaganda really impacted was, like, the success of the Wii U, because so many people were gaslit into thinking the console was just, like, an accessory or whatever by the corrupt gaming media. But like when I look at what's happening now, like when I look at how these people act about these new upcoming Nintendo games, like more and more, I'm convinced that like these agendas, these narratives aren't going to stick. You know, 10 years ago, people were pushing like Kid Icarus Uprising and Paper Mario Sticker Star as like some of the worst things ever, right? One of the worst games Nintendo has ever put out. And like now, Kid Icarus Uprising is seen as like the GOAT, one of the most innovative revival series Nintendo has ever done, a huge deal. People are like begging for a re-release on Switch. And the Sticker Star trilogy has done phenomenally well. You know, I think Origami King is now like the second highest selling game in the franchise, right? Like, you know, we're getting a remake of the Thousand Year Door soon. Like Paper Mario is in a good place, right? In spite of the narratives, in spite of the agendas, in spite of the conspiracies, in spite of the lies, you know, all of that collapsed because there are still people who like and want to play these games. I am very, very excited about the future of Nintendo properties, of Nintendo hardware, but it really needs to be said that it's becoming really notable just how many amazing classic games have just been downplayed and ignored over the years. You know, like there was an incident earlier this week where you know, I was involved in this altercation with these no-name streamers, right? Who were going over my top 10 video games list. I was kind of shocked at just how many of these games like either of those guys have never played. You know, one of them had not played a single one of them, right? You know, Ace Attorney, Dragon Quest, Donkey Kong Country, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Star Fox 64. Like Yoshi's Island, like all of these big, big names in games, you know, games that have established themselves as like the best ever. Like, oh, I'm not gonna play that. It's probably not that good. I like again, I get tired of hearing this stuff. And I think this kind of stereotypical behavior from people who have like only ever played a handful of Nintendo games growing up, stuff like usually something like Ocarina of Time or Super Mario 64. Like there's this mindset that like everything outside of those like of the core Nintendo games, the ones that everyone have played are like bad games, right? And Tears of the Kingdom is getting slammed a lot. Super Mario Galaxy 2 got slammed a lot. Like, what else has been like downplayed and ignored over the years? You know, I'm sure there's a lot of DS games. I've been talking a lot about how New Super Mario Bros. Was downplayed and like the weird kind of narrative that like people like Scott the Woz are pushing that like New Super Mario Bros. Somehow killed 2D Mario. You know, in spite of being highly successful, highly lucrative, highly popular games, right? We we've seen like people try to like declare Pokemon to be a failure, you know, pretending Pokemon is super glitchy when it's not. Like we've seen people like complain about Splatoon and like um you know, all of the niche games that are coming out, stuff like Trace Memory I think is going to get slammed. I know Detective Pikachu Returns got slammed, right? Like we have all of these like gems that have come out in the past several years that have just gotten ignored because of game journalists that want to pass themselves off as like deep, insightful critics by criticizing media, right? By criticizing Nintendo properties, right? Right? Like when you get right down to it, like I don't necessarily think that Tears of the Kingdom is better than Mario Galaxy 2 or Super Mario Bros. Wonder or a lot of other Switch games, right? Like I'm not sure where I would rank the game personally, but like when I actually think about what has actually happened. Like most people wouldn't even consider these other Nintendo games to even be close to what Tears of the Kingdom accomplished. But for me, it's very important to kind of talk about like other genres, to talk about less popular genres, to talk about stuff other than open world games, to value those older Zelda games that were heavily downplayed. You know, to talk about the Mario games that were heavily downplayed, right? Like the way it's looking now, I uh, I think that eventually there will be so many Nintendo fans out there who love so many different games that it's going to be very, very difficult for anyone to kind of argue that any of these games are like bad or have any kind of like issue with them. Like we've seen this with Pokemon to a certain extent, where Pokemon fans have like risen up against the arguments put forward by people who don't play the games. You know, people who say the games are too repetitive and the same thing over and over again, and people who have been complaining about the glitches. Like over the past couple of years, like Dexit has ended in the Pokemon community, and it's only like non-fans that are still pushing this meme that Game Freak is a bad studio, right? The Splatoon community is similar. Like, how much longer do we have to go before people start to acknowledge that people who don't play Nintendo games should not be judging their overall quality?